March 30th, 2023. And if you'd please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
That's not bad.
To the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Chair, I will let you.
All right. We're buried in paper right now. A couple of weeks ago, a week and a half ago, I guess, we had a preliminary review of the draft budget that Mr. Silsback prepared for us. And tonight, he's going to be presenting his final budget. Certainly looking through it, there have been some changes that I'm sure he'll speak to between the budget that we were introduced to last time and the budget tonight. So, Madam Chair, I don't know if there's any comments you want to make?
At this time, I don't particularly. I spoke with Mr. Silsback, was it only earlier today?
Yes.
You know, about the binders. He recognized that they were not out to us as early as they had hoped. So we appreciate that, the effort that went into them. I'll open any questions, comments from the boards at this time?
Thanks for the larger font.
You're
Okay.
welcome.
Well,
Is anyone in the audience, audio or video recording? And I see none. Okay, thank you.
well, Justin, I'll turn this over to you.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Chair. And to echo Selectwoman LaBrie's thoughts, I just want to thank once again the extra times we get this together. We do have some new additions on our team and some moving parts that we're trying to address. So thank you for the extra time. We're here this evening to review the fiscal year 2024 budget presentation. And please, as always, as we move through this, if you have any questions, feel free to stop me and we can address it at that time, or if you prefer to hold off, we can certainly answer it at the end as well, whatever you're more comfortable with. So just to highlight, the budget book you have includes the town manager's transmittal letter that we had reviewed at your previous meeting, the general water, wastewater, and transfer station budgets, estimated revenues for state aid, local receipts, and other available funds, a breakdown of indirect cost calculations for school, water, sewer, and the transfer station, as well as this PowerPoint presentation that we're going through right now. The budget priorities, as always, are to present a balanced budget that meets the needs of the community while setting the town up for future success, provide the resources necessary to adequately fund critical services, accurately and equitably calculate indirect costs for the enterprise funds and school department, and provide the public with a transparent and digestible view of all the information used in the development of this budget. Looking down the road, future budget goals, which in many ways reflect last year, is to continue adhering to financial policies approved by the Board of Selectmen and Finance Committee. I know that we've implemented a few new ones over the past couple of years, and so we continue to work towards those goals. Proactively identify and prepare for future community needs, build stabilization funds to insulate the town from financial liability and future unforeseen expenses, particularly with the way things have been over the past couple of years globally. Build on and maintain a capital improvement plan that paints an accurate picture of existing capital assets and future needs, and explore opportunities to share resources with the Winchton Public Schools and regionalize efforts with surrounding communities. And we did have a big push in that area this year as well as part of this conversation. The budget process is laid out as followed. So we kicked things off officially on March 13th with the review of the draft budget. We're here this evening on the 30th for the final budget. The town meeting warrant closes on April 3rd. We'll be reviewing a preliminary list of warrant articles this evening. The Finance Committee public hearing is set to occur on April 26th. A previously distributed budget had it listed as April 25th, but after conversations, we bumped that to the 26th, so please make note. and the annual town meeting is set to take place on May 15th, 2023. You all good?
Sorry,
No, you're fine.
I couldn't find it.
No, that's fine. So anticipated warrant articles, and once again, please stop me if anything jumps out at you. There's some of the usual suspects on this list. There's a few new ones too that I'll elaborate on a little bit as we make our way through. So for the special town meeting, as typical, a committee report and payment of prior year's bills. For the annual town meeting itself, a committee report, an opportunity to establish or discharge committees. The third is a new one to establish a PEG Media Enterprise account. So that's one area where we have our water, wastewater, and transfer station enterprise accounts. PEG funds is always something that traditionally is just passed through the budget and is expended, I guess, in line with every other expense we have. The intent of this is, now that the Communications Committee has put in all the work to renegotiate that contract with Comcast, with the intention of making sure we stay on top of the existing broadcasting system, maintain it regularly. We want to make sure that we carve out and track those funds a little more closely as its own separate enterprise. So that's the intent of this. There is a proposed budget going forward, and so one item that I would highlight in the budget that you may have noticed is all of the Comcast revenue that typically comes in, we pulled out on the front end, and we pulled out all the expenses for broadcasting on the back end, and then built them together into that enterprise system in one package.
So what does the acronym PEG stand for?
Oh, it's public access and, or public education and government, I believe, something like that, yeah. Number 4, authorize revolving funds, which is typical. Number 5, the senior tax work-off program. In recent memory has stood at 8,800, but we've struggled to staff that traditionally, so we did scale it back, one individual to 7,700. If there's, if we have a situation where people are knocking down the door for that opportunity, we can look to increase it next year. But I will note on the other end of things, and it's not a one-for-one swap, but number 6, the Community Action Committee nonprofit support, the CAC, we did increase by 10%. So they're typically, in recent memory, at 25,000. We increased that to 27,500. That decision, or recommendation rather, is based off of the conversations that we had within the last month, or maybe a little bit prior, with members of the CAC giving their annual report, and I guess where they showed data highlighting the increased need over the past few years, particularly after the pandemic. It seemed like a worthy cause. Article 7, this is the general government budget, so we're voting to raise or appropriate $16,743,988, and we can drill down into that number a little bit more as we move through this presentation. Article 8, the fiscal 24 water department enterprise budget at about $1.2 million. Article 9, the fiscal 24 wastewater department enterprise budget at about $1.6 million. Article 10, the fiscal year 24 transfer station enterprise budget at about $270,000. Article 11, the fiscal year 24 PEG access and cable related enterprise budget. I think I might like to workshop a different name with all of you if anybody has anything that flows a little better, but for now, in draft form, we'll run with that. And that is the $111,300 in Comcast fees that I previously referenced.
Can you explain Comcast fees?
Yep, so it's anything that's coming in as part of the new agreement. So the biggest increase that you're gonna see, so you have one piece, which is the user fees, but the biggest piece you're gonna see is what you had carved out with the Communications Committee in terms of increased capital expenses. I believe the exact figure was about, I think we agreed to $40,000 annually, but then they agreed to front load in the first year so that we didn't have to save up. We could do repairs now.
But did we increase user fees?
As part of that Comcast agreement, I think they tack it on. It's like maybe $1, but that was as part of the agreement through the Comcast agreement.
I don't feel like we were made aware of that.
Okay. Any other questions?
I thought that the Comcast fees were recognized in the, on the revenue page, the revenue report.
Did you see them in there?
That's what I'm looking for. There was significantly, I want to say they used to run about 35,000, 40,000.
It's a smaller figure. We can go through and try to identify that. There are some, or I should say, there is some overlap in some roles where some of it is, there are roles funded through the general fund, but roles also funded in part by that revenue. So like IT support, for example, or our administrative assistant, I think it's a 82, 18% split or something along those lines, but we'll look into that and make sure we're not counting it twice.
I guess I was wondering where the 111,300 comes from, if the annual fees are typically in the 30s.
I'm looking to Ms. Daigle, who can highlight it a little bit further, but there actually is a tab in your book that breaks it down a little bit. It's the PEG Access Cable Fund tab.
Mr. Chairman or Madam Chairman? So with the updated contract agreement that we negotiated in October, the annual fee, the fees that we collect quarterly have gone up significantly. It was 1% before, and now it's at 3.25. So we've gone up from between 8,000 and 9,000 to 27, 28, 29,000 we will expect this fiscal year coming up. We've received one payment already of 27,000.
So annually, what does Comcast pay the town?
Well, because this is the first year of the contract, and we don't know exactly what the fees were going to be, but it's estimated to be about $28,000 a quarter for the quarterly fee, and then the capital that we negotiated with Comcast is $120 altogether, which is broken down 4 year, and so $30,000 for 4 years. We received one payment already.
Okay, so the annual Comcast fee is roughly $120,000.
Yep, but I estimated, if you look in the budget, I estimated it conservatively, because I'm just not, it's the first year, and I just want to make sure that we have enough. So I expect it to be higher than what I'm projecting. Which will be good.
My frame of reference was 35,000
Yes,
annually.
it will be much more.
So it's quite a
120.
bit more. So I was just wondering, if it was 35,000,
Yeah.
where was the rest of the budget coming from?
Thank you, Linda.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions on that one? Excuse me. Article 12, the fiscal year 24 school budget, which is at just a hair under 17 million. Article 13, the fiscal year 24 Monty Tech assessment, which is at 706,060. We'll carry over onto the next slide. Article 14 through Article 21 are part of the capital improvement plan. Just to run through it as a reminder, we break them down by funding source. So there are 14 items on the capital plan. We're going to review them as part of this presentation, but so if you have Article 14, for example, anything being paid for out of free cash would be in that article. 15 would be anything for a 5-year borrowing. 16 would be a 5-year borrowing from the transfer station. 17 would be a 5-year borrowing from the Water Enterprise Fund. 18 would be grants or other sources. That's typically the 911 grant. Article 19 and 20 are the $1 million paving plan that we had proposed, so there's a separate funding schedule for that. Of that, $550 free cash is a mix of conservative estimation of cannabis funds, but also May-Barty remediation funds, just as a reminder. The 5-year borrowing of $450, we're proposing paying down using future cannabis revenue, a very conservative, modest amount, because once again, we're projecting about $250, but we don't want to, lock in the assumption that we're going to have access to that $250, because it's a pretty volatile funding source. Number 22 is a cemetery expansion, which we paid for out of, 21 is a leaf loader from Cemetery Perpetual Care as part of the capital plan. Article 2 is a cemetery expansion, be $50,000. It's not purchasing an item, it's land we already have, but it's work that needs to be done. So effectively, we're running out of space. It's something we've addressed briefly in a few public meetings. And this, in conjunction with the Robinson Broadhurst grant, would help them expand the town cemetery off Glen Allen. Number 23 is a general code adoption. So this was an initiative that predated me, but was never actually finalized. So we're going through the process of wrapping that up. That's one of the things that Mrs. Daigle is working on prior to her departure. Basically, it's all of our essential town documents wrapped together in one place, but there needs to be a vote to approve of that combined document. Article 24 is a zoning bylaw amendment, so, and I believe there's an email distributed to the Board of Selectmen referencing that the planning board was going to be reviewing the signage bylaw again. As part of that process, though, we're asking that members of the planning board, either under a quorum or a quorum of them in a joint meeting, meet with the Board of Selectmen directly to hash out any concerns there might be on that, to have a more complete document moving forward. Article 25 is $39,250 appropriation we're recommending from ARPA. It's a matching grant, something similar we had done in a recent town meeting or special town meeting for asset management purposes. Article 26 is to establish, or I should say 26, 27, and 28 are all related to the opioid payment, the settlement there. So in conversations that we had with Gamma and Representative Zlotnick, we had talked about the town combining resources as recommended by the Attorney General's office with some surrounding communities to have more bang for our buck in terms of the use of those funds. But in order to do that, given our form of government, we have to have a formal town meeting vote to appropriate those funds. We can't just, sign them away. And so these three pieces number 26 would establish an opioid remediation stabilization fund. A typo there, excuse me. Article 27 would accept the fourth paragraph of Chapter 40, Section 5B. And to explain what that is, that basically allows the town to authorize a funding source. In this instance, it's a one-time but reoccurring funding source, basically perpetually, without having to go back and revote it over and over again. So where we get annual payments, you wouldn't have to vote every year to pay it back out per the agreement. And then number 28 would be to dedicate receipts from the statewide settlement. So that would be the specific appropriation itself in the first year to go towards that cause. So those numbers are still kind of in flux. When we last discussed them, they were close to finalized, but it's my understanding that they might change again. It's not a significant amount. I wouldn't quite call it a windfall, but once again, combined with other communities, there's an opportunity to do some good there. And we did get some feedback from our police and fire chiefs on that as well as part of that conversation. So at this time, we have 28 articles on there. It is in draft form. And I believe this upcoming Monday at noon, the warrant is officially closing. So there could be some things that slide in there, but we'll present that in the draft budget.
Mr. Solzback,
Or
just
warrant.
number
Yep.
27, I'm assuming that's referencing Mass General Law,
Correct.
Chapter 4, just if MGL in there would be helpful, I think.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks. Any questions about any of those? Yep.
On the cannabis income revenue, what you have 225,000 estimated for the prior years? I'm just curious how you come up with that estimated amount.
Sure. Great question, and good for the folks watching at home too. So for cannabis, it's a new revenue, and so we don't really have much of a track record for it yet, and that's why we're kind of skittish about the way that we spend it and the amounts in which we spend it. And so that number is based on projecting out what we've received to date from the Bud Barn, which is the first one that had opened, which we have about a year of data on. The question mark, though, is Toy Town Healthcare next to Harbor had opened relatively recently, and we don't know, A, how much they're realistically going to earn, but B, how much them opening is going to impact the trends over at Bud Barn, if it's going to cannibalize any of those sales or anything. So that roughly 250 figure, what we're projecting is a lower amount for Bud Barn based on the 1 year of data we have, plus a really stinted, best estimation for Toy Town Healthcare. I do think it's going to exceed that number, but I'd be hesitant to put anything out beyond that.
So piggybacking on the last question, the local receipts projections that you have for, excuse me, the marijuana tax for FY '24 is $40,000. Excuse me. This year's was $225,000. You expect to supersede that. Now, as the way I understand the plan, the paving plan, is that we'd fund, goodness, $550,000 out of free cash this year. And there's an assumption, I guess, that between marijuana income and miscellaneous income from Maybardi, that those two items would generate about $550,000 of free cash between them. So the marijuana tax, we've already budgeted, we've included in this year's budget $225,000. So that would mean that it would have to generate beyond the $225,000. Let's say another $300,000, or whatever you were planning on, beyond the $225,000, which means would have to be bringing in about $500,000 or $600,000 in just the marijuana fees. And it doesn't look like we're on that kind of a track. And it's similar with Maybardi in that right now you're planning, including in the budget, $341,000 for Maybardi, which is part of the revenue package that doesn't, that supports the budget, that doesn't include at this point in time the paving.
So I guess I can answer that in two parts, but I get what you're getting at. So, so the paving plan, to jump back, so the 550 in free cash, it's free cash that's going to be certified at the end of this year based on revenue that we know we're going to take in to date. So that number is concrete. Maybardi had already exceeded the amount contractually that they had to give us, and then it was something like $1 a ton every ton thereafter. So they're on trend to hit that very easily. The same thing for cannabis funds, and neither of those had, even though they were built into the revenue for fiscal year '23, revenue has exceeded projections, and so we're comfortable in knowing that money is going to fall to free cash. So that solves one half of the problem. The other one, and I understand what you're saying, and I agree that there's probably going to need to be a tweak there, is that if we're calling for a 5-year borrowing, the amount of 450, and say, depending on the interest rate, that comes out to about 85,000 a year, that we would need to put in, I guess that added revenue, 85, but also that added expense, adding it on to the debt service. It would kind of pass through a one-for-one. Would that resolve the question that you have for the first piece?
But that would tell me how the plan is for the future years when you're borrowing the money to pay off the rest of that, the $450,000. That would be built into the budget as an expense.
Right.
And your assumption there is that, or not the assumption, whatever you're projecting for marijuana income and Maybardi income would be part of the revenue. So those two things would be in the budget.
And they would offset each other. I agree, and they're not. So, so I guess a question is, and And we're gonna make that change. I agree with what you're saying, and I appreciate that you shed some light on it. I wouldn't want to lump it into the overall debt service line, because I feel like things get lost that way. Has there ever been any past precedent, or would there be an appetite for building that in as like a roads debt service in the DPW budget? So we'd still plug in that revenue, but then call out that debt service line over the next 5 years for the sake of transparency, to further highlight that it exists, rather than burying it in the debt service line. And we can drill down on this more offline too, if you want to think about it a bit. But
Yeah,
those
I
are my
don't see what
preliminary
you
thoughts.
gain by doing that. I mean, once it becomes an expense, and you've got, you know, you're, in your mind, you're saying, okay, we've got $90,000 a year that we're financing, and we're in the revenue side, we've got $250,000 a year coming that we anticipate for revenue. So,
Right.
you know, some revenue, I mean, we're not earmarking revenue for an expense, it's part of the budget. It's this year's, it's the first 550 that I'm concerned about, because the thinking is, well, we didn't budget anything, so if we bring in $300,000 in marijuana fees this year, then that would become free cash because it wasn't part of our revenue package. But according to this, there was part of it that was part of the revenue package.
Right.
$250,000. So that means if we brought in 300, we really have an extra 50,
Right.
not an extra 300. So that's where the math seems to not reflect what's likely to become free cash. Maybody's different, because Maybody, we didn't have anything in there
Right.
on that line item. So if they came in with 300,000,
Right.
that 300,000 would become free cash, assuming the rest of the budget balances out. You know, we don't end up short on some of the other revenues than we would anticipate.
Right. I'm in agreement with you, and I think part of it is we're nine months of the way, 3/4 of the way through the year. At this point, I think we have a pretty good handle on what revenue is gonna be, so I do believe we're gonna exceed that figure, pretty handily, but I think I agree with you, I think it's something worth watching as we go down to the finish line, and if our revenues suddenly drop off and we come up short in that area, there's potential for some concern there, so, we'll keep an eye on it.
Okay, and I guess I just, again, point out that it's not the revenue from marijuana, it's the revenue beyond what we budgeted, the $225,000 that theoretically would generate additional free cash.
Right. Any other questions? Thank you. So we just have a breakdown of the budget reconciliation. You can see that for real and personal property taxes, which is the main driver for our revenues, came in at about $14,647,139. In addition, we are calling out the prior override with inflation adjusted for 2.5%. 50,000 of that figure, as highlighted in a side letter in your binder, was attributed to the schools. Historically, it has gone to the schools. The recommendation for this year is for $324,659 to come to the town side, and we're gonna dive into that a little bit more too as we go through the presentation.
I'm not sure why we ever put the override numbers in every year, but that's not an additional $324,000. That's part of the $14,647,000 that we collect in property taxes.
That's a separate piece. So typically, you have the real and personal property tax on the top line, and then there were some complaints about this last year from some citizens, but the override number is built into the school side, but not called out like this on the budget reconciliation. Is your concern that we're counting it twice?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so I can assure you we actually backed into that number, the 14,647. So that number is reflective of last year's,
See, it's part of the property tax that we collect. It's not a separate fund, it's part of the property tax. What we agreed to when we voted Prop 2.5 override is to override the limit of Prop 2.5 that year.
So, well, it's held out separate as an override beyond what the existing is. So, and I'm just talking about past practice and the way it's been accounted for. So in previous years on the sheets, that total override amount was built into a separate, effectively a revenue source for the schools, supporting the schools. So there's a separate sheet on the budget workbook where you can pull it out and see that we plugged in 50,000 separately for the schools. So I know that traditionally you would see the real and personal property tax line as you see it right here, and then the next line would be blank. That's because the total amount, which this year it would have been 374, 659, was plugged in on the back end somewhere at the schools.
So
In
you're saying
addition to
that-
this,
That what we really collect in property taxes next year would be about 15 million.
correct.
In
About.
this year's, but, okay, and the original reconciliation, just had the property tax. I've never seen on the revenue side a separate line for how we spend it.
Yeah, so I think part of the intent there is we wanted to call it out specifically to avoid any instances of somebody claiming that we were trying to do it quietly. So that's a transparency effort. And we also wanted to kind of highlight, once again, that 50 was going to the schools and 324 was going to the town.
Okay, good.
Okay. We did see an increase on state aid, an increase on local receipts. There was a modest increase on the indirect charges, and we're gonna go through all of these individually as we go through. So leading with the total appropriations of $34,872,870, which balances out to zero. Yes.
Why do we separate out the homeless transportation? Is that state aid,
So
state reimbursement?
once again, that's a carryover from past practice. Not quite sure why we carve it out separate. We can look into it. I'll get you, I'll
Yeah,
give you
just
a good reason.
Curious.
Yeah,
On the, it seems to me we talked about it earlier this year, that it popped up on the revenue sheets.
Right.
It had never been on the revenue sheets before.
you're coming with all the good questions today, Tom. All right, moving on, comparisons of annual revenues, fiscal '21 to '24. So, rather than calling this out line by line, if anybody has any specific questions, I'd be happy to point some things out for you, but we're gonna drill down on some of these a little further too as we make our way through. One area that is worth highlighting is the COVID era, at least on this side of things, has ended. It was built in last year, a little bit of support from ESSER funds for transportation, and we have dropped that off this year. So you're not going to see any supplemental COVID funding, at least in this year's budget. And just a visual breakdown, a pie chart. Excuse me, I should say fiscal '24 typo. But just highlighting a majority comes through once again from state aid, with the secondary piece being real and personal property tax. A breakdown of annual real and personal property tax, once again, breaking down the levy limit, the Prop 2.5 increase stacked on top, which gets you into that $14 million figure. The new growth estimate, I wanted to highlight, we've held it at about 85 for the past decade. I did have conversations with our assessor's office, just confirming what we had for outstanding building permits, just to get a better idea of what's realistically driving, what that number is going to be. On trend, it's hovered closer to 100,000 or exceeded it, and there's actually only one instance where it dropped below in the past 6 years, or 5 years, excuse me, if you look at the 5-year look back. So we did bump that up from 85 to 90. And we did have a conversation with the assessor's office about it. And then debt exclusions, a little bit lower than the year prior, but they are taking into account the fire station project that was recently voted, so those are hovering just over 300,000, making the maximum allowable levy of 14,647,139. Further highlighting, yeah.
Can we back up one? the maximum allowable levy is $14,647,000. And that includes, and unless there's another line in there that would have somehow separated what we allowed the levy to increase 8 or 9 years ago.
Yeah, could you
I,
go back a couple of slides?
I'm afraid that that's part of that $14 million.
Yeah, right
Well,
there.
I can't resolve it in this exact moment, so what I'll commit to is, let me take a look at it. We'll
Yeah,
figure out what may have been
please.
crossed there.
You s-
And we'll figure, because it's either, one of those are off, but my guess is it's probably this one. So, in years past, for example, we included solar pilot revenue, which was a big one we ran into, and if you recall last year, the conversation was, well, where's the solar pilot revenue? And we had come to the determination that we were actually calling out solar pilot revenue in a way that was overstating our revenue, because it was already built into personal property tax. So like, that's kind of a good example. So I'll make sure that we're not taking two passes at that. Any questions about debt exclusions? Sure. And just here's a historic chart, so
$325,000.
the recent all-time high is about 800,000. Back in 2012, it dipped for a while in the 15s and 16s, and then it's really held steady over the past 6 or 7 years or so. So, you know, we'll see what the future brings, but for now, it's pretty stable. State aid, so we did see an increase on state aid from the governor's budget for fiscal year '24, about $16.2 million. And just as always, a reminder that that figure needs to be approved down at Beacon Hill, the House and Senate Ways and Means Committee. But it typically doesn't fluctuate too much. If you'd recall last year, I think there was about an $80,000 difference. We ended up swinging around at special town meeting and putting that towards roads. Historic state aid, just giving you a good view, it is a little bit increased over this year. A big chunk of that was towards the schools, and we're gonna dig into that a little bit as well. So just a breakdown of state aid. You could also see the state and county assessment decreased a little bit. State aid went up just over 10%. For indirect charges, those are holding steady. You can see year over year from fiscal '23 into fiscal '24. On the water end of things, they went from 145 to 141. For wastewater, they went from 135 to 141 and change. And so they kind of wash each other out a little bit. If you in transfer station, you see a 31.99% increase, but it's deceiving because the indirect charge on that is typically pretty low. So it was $9,500 the year prior. Now it's $12,500, give or take. And then if you're just looking graphically on this chart, I think it really indicates how steady the indirects have really held. They decreased a little bit heading into 2024, but it's a pretty stable trend. As typical, there's 3 sources: transfers from other funds. They don't really fall into any other typical category, so just to call them out, $20,000 from the stabilization infrastructure transfer, $3,300 from the cemetery trust transfer, and just under $17,000 from Title V lien redemption transfer.
Just to back up a little bit on the enterprise funds, the indirect costs increased quite a bit this year. Certainly a bigger percentage than the overall budget's increased. I just wondering what's driving that.
So we updated and we're going to drill down into those a little further, but for example, well, can we wait till we get to that sheet and then I can show you
Yeah,
directly?
I was gonna ask it when we get to the transfer station section.
Okay, all right, I'll
Okay.
wait on it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Just a comparison of general fund budget uses, so looking down the line, there aren't any significant or major fluctuations year over year. Looking back from the fiscal '21 budget and actual through to the proposed budget in 2024, it's been fairly stable. You do see some increases, and I think it's worth highlighting. The benefit side of things, so health insurance, for example, was about 4.2 million, and now it's almost at 5 over the course of that time period. So it has been a significant burden over that stretch. Some things I wanted to highlight in terms of significant changes in the fiscal '24 funding requests. Some numbers that might jump out at you, but sometimes have a little bit more of an explanation that makes them not quite as alarming. So the Planning and Economic Development Director, that role has been vacant for the better part of a year. It's our recommendation to not backfill it at this point. We did put it out, we did hold some rounds of interviews, and we found that we couldn't particularly find a candidate that was up to snuff, and we didn't want to end up in a situation where we were, throwing out more salary than we would get back in terms of benefit. I think part of the reason that informed that decision is that we've redistributed that role, those duties among the planning office and among my office. The planning side things more so to planning, economic development more so in the town manager's office, and we've seen some success in that area. So we opted instead to take that about $85,000 salary projected and return it to the budget to fund targeted increases in town hall, the library, and council on aging. There's support for those changes in your binder as well in the form of the salary survey done by UMass Boston, a process that we've been going through for about 6 months now. The intent of having an outside third party do that report was to help avoid any appearance or recommendation that there was favoritism, or people were just trying to do favors, or town hall was just trying to boost everybody's salary. It was a third party independent that came through and found that in several areas we were well under market, and so we did strive to bring those up into the middle of the pack. Once again, nothing extravagant. On the public works side of things, some moving parts. So you can see that there's the apparent addition of a DPW assistant, 87,000, but there's a little more to that. So they would effectively serve as a town engineer. It would be somebody that has a stamp, and it would be funded basically from 3 sources. So one would be $36,000 in quote savings, and I say quote because it's being spent elsewhere. But by shifting the DPW director role to assist with the schools as part of the conversation between the town and schools group, there is going to be a retirement coming up in August of the maintenance director, and the proposal is to have that effectively act as like an additional, point person at the school rather than hiring a full-on administrative role. And so there'd be a savings there. The second piece would be the MSW4 DEP order line. You can see it was drawn down by about $40,000. So having a town engineer in-house, they would be able to satisfy that reporting requirement. And so in satisfying that, it would also cover part of the salary. And then the other piece, and this one fluctuates a little bit more, but peer review duties are currently subbed out to a third party. So rather than that, we would have our in-house town engineer do peer review on behalf of the town, rather than paying tie and bond, for example, to do it. And that typically comes around to about $100,000 a year. Yes?
I'm just wondering, since that's a new position with the new role, would that have to be voted on at town meeting?
So as part of this budget, it would be voted on, because they'd be voting to approve the salary.
But line item, not a separate warrant article, is
Yeah,
what I'm asking
we
you.
can call it out separately if that's the preference. So I know you're referencing a piece in our charter that says if there's like organizational changes or something, it needs to be approved in the annual town meeting. So I did bounce that off legal counsel about a year and a half ago when we were talking about some structural changes down in the planning and development office. And at that time, it was a little bit of a head scratcher for them, and the determination ultimately was that by having the town vote to fund that role, that is approving the existence of that role. But if there's something that you would like to do that calls it out a little bit more specifically and puts a spotlight on it, I'm welcome to any recommendations.
I feel like that would be the honest thing to do,
We can work together
so
on it.
people know.
Mhm.
I have a question.
Yes.
So are you saying that you're gonna bring in an engineer and the salary's gonna be 87,000?
Roughly, so, and that's a good
For an
question.
engineer, that
Yeah,
doesn't seem,
I'm
is
gla-
that part-time?
I'm glad you asked it. So, Brian and I had talked about that a little bit. We think realistically 95 might be closer in terms of the struggle of getting people to drive out here. But there are some opportunities, typically some folks that are just getting into the field or just coming into the municipal side. But we may also hold off until the actual switch, the official switch happens in August, to bring somebody on board. And so that's not representative of 12 months of the fiscal year. It's realistically representative of 11. But I'm glad that you honed in on that. Any other questions about that piece? And then lastly, an additional 22,000 has been earmarked for snow and ice, which isn't a huge splash, but it's a step. So that mostly has come out of concerns voiced by some in this room, and I share the concern that while it's typical to keep your snow and ice line item fairly low, because once you bring it up, you can't bring it back down again, we've consistently on trend blown past that number significantly year over year. And it ends up eating into our free cash number. So it's, you know, you're artificially keeping things low. And so the hope is that if we continue to do this a little bit year over year, we can build something up that's a little bit more realistic in terms of what that expense is. So what you see there, that $22,000 figure, it's a $10,000 increase to the snow and ice overtime line, a $10,000 increase to the snow and ice material line, and a whopping $2,000 increase to the snow and ice for finance committee. So incremental, everybody gets a little bit there. On the broadcasting end of things, as highlighted, we've pulled out revenue from Comcast and expenses from broadcasting and put them out in a separate enterprise fund. So it may look like there's a big cut there, but realistically, we're just pulling it out and accounting for it separately. Excuse me. Health insurance, this expense continues to grow. They'd originally come back, they being Maya, with about a 10% recommended increase. Our team negotiated it back down closer to 7. And so what that represents in real world dollars in terms of our budget is a $160,000 increase year over year between retirees and active employees. So that's the number you saw there. And then school in-town transportation, there's a contractual increase, and that represents about $150,000 expense to the fiscal year 24 budget, which is a pretty significant bite as well that you may see in terms of a peak point. Any questions about any of those items?
Actually, Justin, I'm sorry, on the health insurance, how long have we been with Maya now?
We were with the GIC.
Right.
And then we had a 3-year period with Maya that we just renegotiated and re-upped last year for another 3 years.
For the
So
3
we're
years.
currently in year 4, going into year 5.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. And I guess to build off that, we have had conversations about going out again and trying to kick the tires on that, but it's the hard part is GIC is very high right now too. So
Everyone is, I'm sure, but-
there's really nowhere to run to, but for the sake of doing due diligence, I think it would be good,
Yeah.
just to know definitively that, you know, if there's some savings there, I'd like to identify it.
Thank you.
Fiscal 24 capital plan, so as highlighted earlier.
Pulse back?
Just-
Yes.
I just wanted to point out that the health insurance line item
Mhm.
doesn't include the increase in OPEB money. If you remember the policy, we were going to put in 5%, I think, of the overall
Mhm.
thing. Last year, it was left out of the budget, we used free cash to do it.
Mhm.
But the rationale behind that is that that's an every year expense. It's not a once in a while expense if we've got the money. So it's kind of disappointed that it didn't make the budget again this year.
Your disappointment is shared. So I think as we can go through and highlight the tightness in some of the areas that we saw, you know, I think we were able to show some discipline in some other areas. But that was something we weren't able to build in. There have been some conversations between you and I, actually, about 6 months ago, talking about once cannabis is a little more stabilized, it might be cannabis revenue. It might be nice to sit down and formalize a plan to fund something like OPEB directly from that. Because if that revenue disappears overnight, if, you know, some policy changes and New Hampshire legalizes, then you're right where you were in terms of trying to find OPEB, but at least you would have a consistent revenue source that you wouldn't miss. And that's really the biggest recommendation for cannabis, is either put it into capital items or stabilization funds. So that might be a good bet.
Yeah, and I'd see it as an expense the town has, just the way it has pensions.
Right.
You know, you can't take pensions and say, well, we'll use the cannabis money and focus it on pensions or anything else. It's part of the revenue, it's part of the expenses, but it doesn't show up in the expense. And, you know, we're never going to get to the point where we can develop an OPEB fund that could actually benefit the town if we don't start putting that money away. No.
Point taken. Thank you. So 14 items in the capital improvement plan totaling in about $2.5 million. Once again, 1 million of that is a paving plan, so it's realistically about 1.5 million. We have reviewed this together as a group. Does anybody care to dig into any of these items any further? Okay. And once again, please feel free to stop me as we go along. So the proposed school budget, you can see fiscal 20 over to fiscal 24. Fiscal 20 was about 13.8 million, and it's grown fairly substantially to just under 17 million over that 5-year stretch, which is a good thing. It's, you know, it's good to fund the schools, but I think you can also see that highlights some challenges for the town side government. So the state has picked up and increased some funding there, but it has resulted in the need for town side investments as well that eat into some other areas. So if you're looking at net school spending, by example, fiscal 24 and fiscal 23, net school spending increased just in the past year alone by 1.5 million. It's a significant challenge. And a lot of that's driven by the Student Opportunity Act, something we've discussed in a couple meetings, and something that was discussed extensively with the town school group. So when I'm talking about some of these financial challenges we're having, you know, this is kind of a good example of one of them. It's going towards a good cause, but it's pretty limiting for a small town with limited resources. And just to highlight historic trends, so, because I know there's been a lot of discussion over, you know, taking some of the override for this year as agreed to in that town school letter, or sending it back to the schools permanently. And so what this chart illustrates is basically in fiscal year 20, with the school budget being blue and the town budget being orange, the two organizations are about $25,000 apart in terms of budget. And then you can see COVID hit, town side took a big dip. Once we had, you know, you started getting into the 112 budget era, and as we dug our way out, school stayed fairly steady and continued to climb, and the town side never really recovered. So as proposed, there's still about a $1.9 million gap between those two organizations in terms of funding. If the override were to return to the school and we were to make those cuts in the town budget, that gap would grow to about 2.5 million. So just as a visual aid. Comparison of indirects. So for the school department specifically, fiscal 24 versus fiscal 23, you can see the increases there. There were some changes, and this is getting Mr. Kane into some of the indirect conversation.
Sorry, a little bit slower?
Sure. This is getting, Mr. Kane, into some of the indirect conversation that you had talked about previously. Okay. So there has been some turnover in some of these roles, so you will see increased salaries, and that reflects a little bit on the school department. And so when you look at the bottom line number of 23 being at $3,065,000 and then increasing in 24 to $3,197,000. Also some changes to health insurance and some other items too. But I think, are you still looking? Looks like you're scanning. Good, okay. Monty Tech assessment, so just a historic review, they are projecting a decrease in enrollment from Winchendon next year. But we wanted to kind of give an idea of historically what the funding was. And so last year, you were looking at about 702, 108 for Monty Tech. This year, they came in, actually it was relatively high, and then knocked it down to 706, 060. So fairly stable over last year.
I don't know if you can answer this or not, but looking at these numbers, does that mean that the difference, the fewer kids that are going to Monty Tech, is Murdoch retaining those kids, or are they going someplace else?
I can answer that.
Okay.
We had a contract with Monty Tech that they only took so many.
Oh, no,
students,
I get that,
but
yeah.
There were many towns out of the 21 that didn't use theirs. They're using them, so they
Oh,
don't
no,
have-
I understand that, but I guess what I'm saying is, instead of the kids who now don't go to Monty Tech, are they staying at Murdoch, or are they going elsewhere?
Murdoch has increased their enrollment slightly, and they're hoping to do it more, but not all of them have come back, but some of them have.
Okay,
Yeah.
so they're maintaining the same number of
Yeah.
students?
Yeah.
Okay,
All right.
thank you.
So the proposed water fund budget, so as you recall, the Board of Selectmen about a year ago voted, about this time actually, a year ago, voted in 2 years in a row of increases that would put us on a path to starting to build retained earnings again. So I'm happy to report that we are showing positive for water and wastewater for the first time in about 5 years. So the recommended increase for this year on the water side of things is 8% in fiscal year '24. And I do just want to highlight that that increase does not include the potential, or definite, but to be determined future costs of the water main from Ashburnham. And we're still kind of narrowing in on what those numbers are going to be. As I mentioned, we're projecting a surplus for the first time in 5 years, but beyond the water pipe, it's also important to highlight in terms of fiscal health that you want to try to get up to about 5 to 10% of the annual operating budget in terms of retained earnings. So that's something we should continue working towards. And just a comparison here of the actual budget year over year from fiscal '22 through '23 and into '24. So you can see, last year you were looking at about $1,111,505. Fiscal '24 is about $1,206,357.
Mr. Silsbeck, it was the indirect costs for the enterprise funds that I was most interested in, because, again, they seems reasonable increase in terms of personnel expenses, but then you get the indirect costs that have jumped almost a, third, 30%.
Yep, so I just want to see if we break that down. Sorry, just a moment. Oh, here it is. Oh, it's not broken down specifically. So as I mentioned in the draft review, we did an adjustment to that. So they weren't carrying all salaries, specifically salaries in my office. So the change that you see there is the addition of basically, the town manager's office salary. Do you have the total figure? So it comes out to about a $19,811 increase. I don't know why it wasn't being carried in years past. A lot of that work does steer through my office in terms of oversight, trying to identify grants, the rate conversation that we had the year prior, it's pretty justified. But I'd say that's the biggest change. And then once again, increases the salaries in terms of turnover. So last year, by example, where the town accountant salary was versus where it is this year, things like that, and they kind of compound.
So the formula changed a little bit?
The percentages are still the same. I want to say is it about 9.1, is it on there? 6.9. Oh, excuse me, 6.9. So it's 6.9 of whatever salaries are plugged in. So I'd say the formula changed in the sense that salaries that weren't plugged in previously are plugged in now. And salaries that may have been one number, a lower number in the year prior, are higher now.
So that's obviously true for the 3 enterprise funds. They're all pretty much up again, it's not the overall increase, but the increase in indirect costs is kind of dramatic.
Very dramatic, yeah.
So, am I understanding you right, that the salary increases in your office affect water and sewer
Well, so,
indirect costs?
I guess if you're talking about the way that indirect costs work, inherently, it's a percentage of the cost of services provided indirectly, indirects, outside of the organization. And so those indirect services are provided from my office, from the accountant's office, from the treasurer's office, by example. And so those enterprise funds are charged that indirect cost of services rendered by town entities over the course of their operations.
So could you answer my question, though? It was, the salary increases in your office or town hall actually affect water indirect costs?
In the most literal sense, yes. So the resources, the cost the expense that it costs the town to have those roles staffed, whatever percentage of that total amount, which is a pre-established formula, is passed on as an indirect.
So the percentage didn't change.
Correct.
And that would apply to the indirect costs for the school, correct? Anytime we see an indirect cost?
To a lesser degree. So my office's salaries was not included for that.
I understand
even
that.
though we do, I mean.
Just trying to wrap my head around indirect
Negligible
costs.
amount from my office, but.
Not just your
yeah.
office, but anything on the town side.
Yep, so if the accountant went up, which it did, if the treasurer's office went up, which it did, then it would carry over to the school side as well.
Okay.
Because it's an increased cost of having those roles staffed.
Yeah,
So,
I
and
do-
they
I do
share a set
understand
percentage of
Yeah.
that, whatever that number is.
Okay, thank you.
And just once again to highlight, we're estimating water revenue at about 35,912 conservatively. So once again, it's a projection. We're still waiting to close out this year and to see where things go. But it's good to see that we're going up instead of down. The proposed wastewater fund budget mirrors a lot of challenges in the water, but as you may recall, we were able to get that down a little bit faster in terms of the increases. And so the increase for sewer that you're seeing this year did you have a question?
No.
Okay, thank you. Rather than 8% on the water side, was 3% for the sewer side. So that also incorporates a recommended $250,000 in annual debt service to resolve upcoming capital needs throughout the wastewater system. We're trying to get ahead of these things instead of playing catch up from behind, which ends up costing you more money in the long run. And then initiatives to take in outside septage may help drive revenue. So that's something that we had talked about maybe 6 or 7 months ago now. We don't have enough data to go on so far, but an effort to take in additional revenue will help us stabilize that number. We've also talked about potentially, if that pans out, being able to raise sewer at a slightly slower pace, or wastewater, I should say, at a slower pace, which if you were to increase the water side, we talked about that blended rate a year or more ago now. A larger increase on the water side would be softened by a lower increase on the sewer side and would balance out. So something to consider in the future.
Can I ask another question?
Yes.
Go back.
One more.
Yeah, wait a minute. When you were talking about the capital improvements to wastewater that you wanted to fund, does that go on capital planning in the 5-year plan?
So it's a separate capital plan. I think
Why?
it just is. It's something we can change if there's an appetite, but historically it's been held separate. So, or actually, I mean, historically I'd offer the town didn't really have a capital plan up until 2 years ago, right? So,
Which is why I'm asking.
sure, so if no one has really expressed an appetite to lump them all in together, if that's kind of the will of the boards and the committee, then we're more than
I
happy to
just
accommodate.
kind of feel like there should be the process, like capital planning goes through, and before it's presented to us. And I don't know, I just feel the process needs to be there.
Yeah, it's organizationally, it's set up a little bit different, in that if you're using, if you're borrowing, you're using free cash from more traditional local revenues to fund the government side of things, you vote on those through the capital plan. But where you have, and it goes to the town meeting and everything else, but where the water and sewer enterprise funds, they operate a little bit differently. And so that debt service is built into those two operating costs, the operating costs for water and sewer. But there isn't necessarily, in the same way that there isn't excuse me, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this, and instead I'm just making it worse. The best way I think to describe it is in the same way that you don't bring water and sewer rates forward to an annual town meeting, those type of expenses you wouldn't bring forward to an annual town meeting either, just because it's the way it's set up. If you want to change the way it's set up, you certainly can. But to date, historically, that's not something you've ever done. I don't know if anybody in this room can think of a time where you voted for a $25,000 filter for the water plant at annual town meeting. So just something to chew on.
Yeah, if I may, to tag on that, I understand it's an enterprise fund, so it's handled a little bit differently. But correct me if I'm wrong, Barbara, I think, I'm trying to think how to word this. If the boards were presented the capital plan for the wastewater treatment, so we see the process of how the capital plan items for those enterprise funds are figured and tracked. It might, pull back some of the curtain of what's going on here, if we at least saw it, so we know what's going on with it. So something to consider.
Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Any other questions on that item? Wastewater we covered. Are there any questions on the comparison here? It's 22 through 24.
I'm sorry, back up just, so we're 3/4 of the way, through December 3rd, so we have a whole nother quarter that's not reflective in that bottom line. Okay, thank you.
Okay. On the revenue side of things for wastewater, we're projecting about conservatively $20,415. And then on the transfer station side of things, it has always been well-performing. Last year, we passed over doing any increases, just given the condition of where everything was, but we would recommend modest increases as referenced in the draft budget a couple weeks ago, just to keep up pace. The biggest concern is trying to avoid future catch-up increases that you saw on the water sewer side of things. And as you can imagine, while everyone, things are tight for everybody right now, the expenses continue to increase too. They don't just, the town can't just absorb that. So it is our recommendation to review that process and to have, realistic, small, incremental increases year over year, rather than, level funding for 5 years and then trying to do a giant catch-up later.
Can I ask another question? Didn't we just buy a truck for the transfer station out of retained earnings?
It's recommended as part of the upcoming capital plan.
Is it upcoming, or we haven't done it yet, but it's upcoming?
So there's one built into the capital plan for this year.
Yeah. that
Are you
we'll be
talking about
voting on.
last year's capital plan or this year's capital plan?
Thank you, Brian.
For the record, state your name, please.
Brian Croto, Public Works Director. So we did buy a pickup last year out of retained earnings. This year, we have a truck that's going to be bought on a borrow. The whole goal on the truck on the borrow is to have us do our own trucking so that we can not have to raise the rates. The rates for trucking have gone up by 30 or 40% due to fuel costs and so on and so forth. So we're looking at different avenues right now to keep the costs down so that we don't have to keep raising the rates down there with what we're seeing for not what we're seeing, but what we're getting hit with right now. So we're still in good shape, but we want to try to beat that curve, is I believe what the town manager's saying.
I just want you to refresh my memory, though, and it was a plow truck, correct, last year?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it's a pickup truck, so it's used,
But it was also like with the plow.
yep, so he plows down the landfill, he plows out the area down there, he fixes the torches on the old landfill. He moves the materials down there around as needed, brings the trash bags from the storage location up. He had a truck 3 years ago, the frame broke. We retired the truck, and we didn't have the money at that time to replace the truck, so we waited till we were financially sound to make that purchase, and we're finally at that point.
And just a comparison of that budget, fiscal '21 through to fiscal '23. You can see incremental changes there. Once again, it's been challenging over the past couple of years, on the town side as well, in terms of cost that we incur, so just something to be mindful of.
I'm sorry, if you'd go back. I'm into the transfer station section, and that 256,098 here is under FY '24, not '23.
Oh, we didn't change the headers, my apologies. So if you shift everything down, so where you see fiscal '21 there, it should be fiscal '22. Fiscal
Okay, so
'22
it's
should be
22,
'23.
23, and 24.
Yep, the numbers are accurate, but the headers are wrong. My apologies.
Okay, thank you. Okay, no, I think it's on the next,
You good?
yeah, that's what I wanted to see, the proposed,
So we're estimating
Yeah.
revenues of about 13,777. So once again, it's not a crazy amount, but it is somewhat healthy. And just like the other ones, it's recommended to try to build up retained earnings in the amount of 5,000 to 10,000, which partly informs the belief that, you know, small incremental rate increases should be continued and incorporated in that budget.
Mr. Salzberg, I'm just curious as to whether or not the number of people who buy the landfill decals, so who take advantage of the transfer station, has there been any kind of a significant increase or decrease? I guess I'm hoping increase. You know, especially where some of the private haulers have had problems getting help, and quality of their service suffered some.
Right. Mr. Crowe can speak to the specifics of that a little bit further.
So, as of recently, we've seen a huge difference. So trash went up for most of us that have private trash pickup, went up $160 a quarter. Since that came out, I bet you we've had 10 people a week coming in buying stickers right now, saying they're not gonna pay those fees, they'd rather come to the town and do the transfer thing. We've also seen an increase in people want to recycle TVs, monitors. We were able to work with Mass DEP to come up with a mattress program and reduce some of our fees. That's made a huge difference. The amount of people dumping mattresses on back roads has slowed, because we were able to come up with a system and get in conjunction with some of our current vendors to be able to reduce the costs, so that people are actually going to the transfer station and doing what they're supposed to. So in a whole, the transfer station's getting much stronger, because we're seeing more people.
Great.
You know, if you compared the 22 small bag revenue to previous years, it doubled. I can't tell you why. They like to buy small bags rather than large bags. It is what it is, but the overall is a larger increase for the amount of people. Generally, we were anywhere from 700 to 850 people using the transfer station. Last year at this time, I ran out of stickers at 1,200, so we ordered 300 more stickers. So it's going in a positive nature. We just can't project how much more positive it's gonna keep going, because if the trash companies keep going in the same direction they're going, I would imagine more people are gonna wanna use the transfer station.
and on that note, you know, going back to the capital plan, the piece of equipment we're proposing to buy will allow us more flexibility for moving those containers around as we need them.
So that's the first phase.
Okay.
The first phase is to get that truck in. The second phase, which I presented to the town manager, and we believe we'll have the truck in time, is to go to the fall town meeting. And if you're familiar with the transfer station, there's 2 compactors there now. Those compactors are the responsibilities of the trucking company now. If we purchase our own compactors with our own containers, now the only out-of-pocket cost that we are paying would be for us to physically hook and haul the dumpster, and we're only paying for the tonnage that we're bringing there. Right now, we're paying the contractor to come in, to drive to us, pick up the dumpster, dump the dumpster, and then come back. So that's incurring costs. So by us going down this road, making some purchases is gonna play out where it's gonna be huge cost savings down the road. The other thing, that's part of this plan down there is, people had asked why the transfer station is open more. So in this capital plan that we presented this year, we're gonna reopen the transfer station on Wednesdays. So now it's gonna give people 4 days to be able to use the transfer station. We may adjust the hours on Thursdays, not to keep staff there till 7, because from 6 to 7, it's like a ghost town. So if we shift those hours a little bit, it still gives the people that want to come in later the ability to come later on Thursdays during the spring, summer, and just a little bit into the fall. So we're trying to make changes based on the feedback that we're getting from the people at the transfer station. By us accepting credit cards or other forms of payment, it's absolutely huge. The fees that are charged, the people don't mind. It's no different than them going to the ATM and getting money out, because it's the same fee. So it's the town adapting to the requests of the people, and that's all we're trying to do, is to make it better and more efficient for them.
I beg to differ, they mind. That drives them crazy.
There's nothing I can do. It's a state law.
Yeah. So, and then, I know it's not on your screen here, but I see that the proposed increases would be, the large bags would go from $4 each to $4.25 each. The small bags would go from $2 to $2.25 each. The landfill decals will go from $70 to $75, and then the demolition materials, $185 to $190.
Right, so on the bags, we're talking about going up 25 cents a bag. So-
Quarter a bag, yeah.
So most people have anywhere from 2 to 4 bags a week, so, you know, we're talking going up a dollar. You know, I haven't moved the rates the entire time I've been here.
Yeah, they've been-
We've been watching the budget, and I don't want to get in a situation where we don't have any retained earnings, or we're not able to make the changes so that we can stay open.
Thank you.
Brian, question. I noticed that the recycling revenues dropped off. Is there a reason for that, or?
So, recycling's tough because it's hit or miss. Sometimes it's busy, sometimes it's not, so it's kind of tough to predict. So it basically, most of our business down there is the trash, the recycling, and the bulky. The other services like paint and light bulbs and computers and monitors, it's great, but it's just not a guarantee, because there's other places around where these people can bring these things, and, you know, we're not the only source, and we're trying to get better to let people know that, you know, we do offer these services, and the prices compared to what's out there is very reasonable.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
You've all asked questions, but once again, are there any questions?
I guess I just have a statement, because I'm looking at the budget, and I'm looking at the town has gone up $625 and, you know, or $625,871. And the school's gone up $1,532,517. How can you sustain that?
And that's a great question. So as part of the 5-year projections, there, I don't want to say some warning signs ahead, but I think we've tried to stress that we're projecting deficits year over year if revenue doesn't pick up or if certain expenses don't continue increasing at the clip they're increasing. So things like healthcare, it's kind of outside of our control. You know, we can shop around, but it's you know, one guy is kind of just as bad as the other. If you're looking at things like escalating school costs, you know, the town side budget includes the transportation costs that went up $150,000 this year, so that's a little, you know, it's a little deceiving that all of that's not town operations necessarily.
If you add that in, you're under 400,000, it's like.
Yeah, so it's still pretty substantial. So the question is, like, what's the way out of that bind if things are going to keep trending in that direction? With, you know, ideally without having to raise taxes, because I mean, that's the easiest route, is like raise taxes, but politically, no one wants to go that route. So it's trying to find ways to rein in costs. I think trying to find creative ways, like, you know, dropping off the economic development director through attrition. I know that there are some people sitting in this room that don't necessarily love that. But if it's an opportunity, it's a non-union position, there's an opportunity to tighten the belt there, well, then we'll tighten the belt. And so I think part of it's going to be having to make those type of hard decisions, tightening up operations wherever we can, looking for new revenue sources. So kind of like we did with down at the wastewater plant, you know, by example. But on the town side, growth. You're obviously held to 2.5%, but if we can try to continue keeping our foot on the gas in terms of seeing improvements like we've seen, you know, throughout town on Central Street especially. The Hillview property behind Milek officially sold and cleared yesterday, and we're expecting a check coming through for the redevelopment authority for that. So seeing that area get developed. The community really needs to focus on smart growth development in the right places that you're zoned to see it. And if...
And those are great long-term projections, but that, you know, you're talking $425,000 increase. The town can't grow on that. So what are you gonna do for the next 2 years or 3 years?
Right. And, you know, folks in this room have been in this town in leaner times. And, you know, worst case scenario, you have to make some drastic decisions. You need to make some cuts organizationally. I don't think we're quite there yet. Like I said, I'm grateful that we are in a situation where, you know, while we were sad to see our planning and economic development director go, but it was a non-union position, and it so happened that it was in the skill set of folks that we have in town hall already to cover some of that and pick up some of that. But we lucked into that. Like, we're lucky that that was there as an option and that we were able to make that type of cut. But some of the increases that we're seeing, they're not extravagant things. It's, you know, things like healthcare. As it is, it's already sort of overfunded in town. We don't have the most attractive benefit package for healthcare. That has hurt us in candidate searches when they are crunching the numbers and they want to see, you know, what the split is between the town and employees. There's not a good immediate solution for that. So I think the best option is, you know, keep trying to stay within our means, keep things tight. You know, dipping into the override, by example, this year is not something that we wanted to do, but, you know, you all saw the budget there. There aren't really any bells or whistles. If anything, we found ways to try to tighten things up and to pull the reins back in a lot of areas. It's a good question. It's going to be a community solution. So right now, my biggest hope is let's keep pushing for growth. I'd also highlight, though, that what we're seeing, the challenges we're seeing as a community, aren't unique to Winchendon. People are seeing them across the board, and really, I mean, if you really want to put things in perspective and you look at the global situation, we're doing pretty good. So something to be mindful of.
Well, I think it's a real tight budget. I'm just amazed that we do as well as we do on that. It's kind of astonishing. When I started to crunch the numbers, I went back 3 times. I thought my calculator had run out of battery or something, because given what we see in town, given the healthcare costs, that everything is escalating, just blew me away.
And that's something Justin and I were talking earlier today, or earlier this week, at our tri-board meetings. I told him that I would like to see every opportunity that we get together as tri-boards or even just an individual meeting, let's talk about
Where we're at,
where we're at.
year to date.
Next, and even, next year to date as well. We have a 5-year, we have a 5-year plan. I think we need to break it down into, 6 months plan. What can we do in the next whatever period of time? We've got to keep on top of this as much as we can.
And maybe as you're going through the year to dates, those departments, line items that you see are getting, that you know are going to go over, tell us what you're doing to mitigate that.
Yeah.
Because we know there are departments that are going to have to do some crunching. They just are.
Yeah.
And we do monitor throughout the year, and we try to do little micro adjustments, even things like when heating, it was clear that heating fuel was gonna go over. We have a stabilization fund, but I directed my staff to not rely on falling back on that, and if possible, lowering the thermostat even by a degree, being more mindful when we're not here for the weekend and heating empty buildings, just little things like that, trying to get ahead of it. So we do that collectively, but as you highlighted, there's not a lot of areas to cut. We try to squeeze as much as we possibly can, but we're pretty squeezed on the
Well, I
town
noticed
side.
the other weekend, the fire chief was actually making runs on a Saturday with his crew. It was great to see him out there, and it was a way to cut some of those extra overtime and expenses and hours, and those are some of the things that I appreciated seeing, and I think you probably will start doing more of it, but as Mr. Kane said, we can't start dipping into our savings because OPEB will come back and crunch us, and pretty soon we'll have a $3 million debt that we have to pay for again.
And I think that's an important part too, in terms of our stabilization accounts and trying to hold enough free cash in hand, is the intent of that is to have it in case of a rainy day. And I think all indicators are showing it's looking kind of cloudy out there, so just something to be mindful of.
Yeah.
I think it might rain.
Any questions from the board at this time?
Other questions from maybe the finance committee? Okay.
Thank you.
Would you care to adjourn, Mr. Kane? And-
Well, we have, the last of our agenda is always public input.
Okay.
And so if there's an opportunity, a question, anybody have a question or public input? Mr. Barbara.
Good evening. Michael Barbaro on 375 Brown Street. I'll be brief. I've had some dental work done, so my mouth is not feeling better. My main concern with the budget, as you might have heard the other night, is that the override money has now been removed from the school department. So I understand that the school department has received additional funding through the Equal Opportunity Act, to which that it's sustainable at this point. They're also using ESSER funds to maintain some jobs that are going away. But the whole purpose of the override was to go to the schools. It was the will of the voters. It's in actual minutes. I have minutes from, 2014. I have minutes from 2016, to which Audrey agreed that the intent was to go to the schools. It's hard to understand that when you're looking at revenue shortfalls and you're sitting on $1.3 million of free cash, and the first place you go is the school budget. We still have an estimated after all the expenses of capital plan,
Right.
we will still have $1.3 million in free cash
Right,
left over,
right.
okay? So there are other ways to build the budget, and I'm not here to tell you how to do it because that's his job. But my biggest disappointment is that we went through COVID with deficits and we did not touch that budget. We've had leaner years, and not many of you would remember that from 2005 to 2015, year after year, we continually laid off staff through attrition and did not backfill positions, to almost 100 positions. I'm fearful that next year you're going to be sitting here saying, sorry, we're looking at not getting a lot of revenue, so I have to take that. Once that money is removed from the school budget, my fear is it never will be put back in, the override, which, let me just finish my conversation. And then, we'll never get that back. Also, there's an agreement that was signed with this joint committee to try to raise the school indirect costs to 5% by 2027. Now, that's $1 million. So if we're funding the schools at 375, and 3 years you need to get to the million, well, that's roughly, $625,000 additional funding that somehow we're estimating we're trying to get to. But if you remove $300,000 from the override, now you're looking at a $950,000 gap to try to fill to get to that 5%. It makes it almost impossible to hit that figure. Now, maybe we hit a rainbow, I don't know. But there is, when you look at this and say, and I understand he's in a rock and a hard place, but we've been there before. But we're also sitting on a lot of available free cash, and the purpose of free cash always has been one-time expenses. And there are one-time expenses in the budget that are being funded different ways. So, I have to stop, but my mouth is killing me. So that is my statement.
Point taken.
And I appreciate the time. And I do appreciate the town manager, believe it or not, we do still talk. But, these are one of the things I fought for years ago. And it's near and dear to me because the schools have gone through a heck of a lot to get where they are. And I'd hate to see them go backwards because now you're back to at least 0.1% over net school spending. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not gonna. Motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn at 8:03, 4, 5, 3. Pick it. We have a second. I didn't have to hit him.
I seconded tonight.
All those in favor? Did you call the vote? All those in
Oh,
favor?
yes, all in favor of adjourning? Aye. Aye. All right.
We are still in session. Briefly, any selectmen's comments or announcements this evening? All right, we do have executive session this evening. I move that the board enter into executive session under Mass General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A, subsection 2, to conduct strategy sessions in preparation for negotiations with non-union personnel, or to conduct collective bargaining sessions or contract negotiations with non-union personnel for the fire chief contract, and also for, under executive session, Mass General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A, subsection number 6, to consider the purchase, exchange, lease, or value of real property if the chair declares that an open session may have detrimental effect on the negotiating position of the body. I do declare reference 283 and 285 Lincoln Avenue, and we will convene into open session for the sole purpose of adjournment.
Second.
Made and seconded, roll call vote, Mrs. Salter?
Aye.
Mrs. Anderson?
Aye.
Mr. Ward?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. We are in executive session at 8:05.